Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. I thought my sister came to court to win a house. I did not realize she had brought a forged contract that could cost her everything, including her marriage, her reputation, and her freedom. The judge looked at the address, then looked at me like she had just discovered a secret empire. That was when my sister smiled and whispered that I was finished. She had no idea I had been ready for months. My name is Scarlett Dyers, and for the last hour I had been practicing the art of becoming invisible. I sat at the mahogany defense table, my hands folded perfectly on top of a pristine manila folder. To anyone watching from the gallery, I probably looked bored. I kept my chin level and my eyes focused on the seal of the court hanging above the judge's bench. I breathed in through my nose for a count of 4 and out for a count of 4. It was the only way to keep my hands from shaking. Inside, my stomach felt as though I had swallowed a handful of broken glass. Every muscle in my back was coiled tight enough to snap. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table was a theater of carefully curated sympathy. My sister, Blair Whittaker, stood there radiating an aura of elegant victimhood. She was wearing a soft cream-colored cardigan over a modest dress, an outfit clearly purchased specifically for this performance. It was designed to make her look soft, vulnerable, and in need of protection. She dabbed at a dry eye with a tissue, sniffing loudly enough for the court reporter to glance up. Then she broke protocol. It was a calculated move, theatrical and sharp. Blair turned her body slightly, ignoring her attorney's hand hovering near her elbow, and looked directly at me. Her sad expression vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Finally, "Your house is mine," she declared. Her voice was not a whisper. It carried across the quiet courtroom, bouncing off the wood paneling. It was loud enough for the beef to straighten up and for the court stenographer to pause her typing. "Ordered Judge Marisol," Keene said, though her tone was more weary than angry. She tapped her gavel once, a dull wooden thud that signaled the beginning of the end. Or so my family thought. Blair sank back into her chair, looking up at the judge with wide apologetic eyes, as if her outburst had just been an uncontrollable overflow of emotion. Next to her, her husband, Grant Hale, leaned forward. He was wearing his Navy Powers suit, the one he wore when he was trying to close a deal he could not afford. He smoothed his tie, his movements jerky and aggressive. He leaned across the narrow gap between the tables. I could smell his cologne, a heavy musk that he used to mask the scent of stale coffee and desperation. "Your little property hobby ends today." "Scarlett," he hissed. His lips barely moved. I did not look at him. I did not blink. I focused on the judge, who was shuffling through the stack of motions Blair's legal team had filed. But inside, Grant's words rattled around in my skull. Little property hobby. That was what they called it. The late nights, the weekends spent scrubbing grout, the years of studying tax codes until my eyes burned, the risks I had taken while they were on vacation. A hobby, Mr. Gill. Silence. Judge Keene warned, her eyes not leaving the documents. The courtroom air was thick, recycled, and smelled faintly of floor wax and anxiety. I could feel eyes burning into the back of my neck. I did not need to turn around to know who was sitting in the first row of the gallery behind Blair, Diane, and Warren Whittaker, my parents. I could picture them perfectly. My mother would be wearing her Sunday pearls, nodding solemnly as if this were a graduation ceremony or a church service, not a lawsuit to strip her youngest daughter of her hard-earned assets. My father would have his arms crossed, looking stern and disappointed, the same look he gave me when I told him I was not going to law school because I could not afford the tuition they refused to pay. They were not here to support me. They were here to witness the correction of a mistake. In their eyes, my independence was an error, and Blair was the rightful heir to anything I had managed to build. Blair's attorney, a man named Mr. Elton, who wore a suit that cost more than my first car, stood up to make his opening statement. He had a smooth, practiced baritone voice, the kind that made lies sound like unfortunate truths. "Your Honor," he began, pacing slowly in front of the bench, "we are here today not just about a property dispute. We are here about a breach of trust, a breach of a promise made between sisters. He gestured toward me with an open palm, a movement that looked inviting but felt like an accusation. Ms. Dyers has a history of erratic behavior, he continued. He let the word erratic hang in the air. Financially reckless decisions, impulsive purchases, followed by periods of heavy debt, while my client is. Hale has always been the stable force in the family, the one who cares for their aging parents, the one who maintains the family legacy. I kept my face stone still. Erratic. That was the narrative. If they could paint me as unstable, as someone who made manic financial decisions, they could justify taking things away. They could justify intervening. Mr. Elton had not used the word guardianship yet, but it was hovering in the room like a dark cloud. They were not just coming for the house. They were laying the groundwork to say I was incompetent. The defendant, Mr. Elton, went on checking his notes, purchased a property in Silver Pine Ridge 2 years ago, a secluded mountain home. It was a massive financial burden for a single woman with her limited visible income. He emphasized the word visible. He was implying illegal money or drowning debt. He had no idea. My sister, out of the kindness of her heart, and to assist with the crushing mortgage payments, Ms. Dyers was struggling to make entered into a verbal and written agreement to co-manage the property in exchange for financial bailouts provided by the family. Ms. Dyers gifted shared ownership and usage rights to the Whittaker family. I felt a flash of heat rise up my neck. Financial bailouts. I had never taken a dime from them, not 1 cent. In fact, I had paid for my mother's dental surgery last year anonymously, funneling the money through Blair so she could take the credit just to keep the peace. And now, Mr. Elton said, his voice dropping to a somber register, Ms. Dyers is attempting to renege on that agreement. She has locked the family out of the property, a property that, I might add, has recently gained significant value and attention. He walked back to his table and picked up a glossy printout. Silver Pine Ridge, Your Honor, recently featured in a prominent lifestyle magazine as a hidden luxury retreat. The value of this home has skyrocketed. It is clear that Ms. Dyers' greed has overtaken her sense of familial duty. She wants to cut out the very people who helped her secure it. He placed the print out on the judge's bench. I knew the article, Top 10 Hidden Winter Escapes. It had been published 3 months ago. That was the catalyst. That was the moment Blair realized the shack I bought was actually a gold mine. The judge glanced at the photo of the house. It was a beautiful shot. The A-frame structure nestled in the snow, the warm low of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the seared deck I had stained myself, and the contract, Judge Keene asked. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. She did not look like she enjoyed theatrics. Mr. Elton smiled. Yes, Your Honor. We have the signed agreement here. He pulled a document from his briefcase with a flourish. It was crisp and white. He handed one copy to the bailiff to give to the judge and walked another copy over to my table. I took the paper. My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I looked at it. It was titled Shared Asset and Usage Agreement. It was dated 14 months ago. The terms were laughable. It stated that in exchange for familial support and monetary consideration, I, Scarlett Dyers, granted Blair Whittaker and her heirs 50% ownership of the Silver Pine Ridge property along with exclusive usage rights for all major holidays. And there at the bottom was my signature. It was a good forgery. The loop on the S was slightly too wide, and the crossing of the T in Dyers was a little too aggressive, but to a layman it looked like mine, signed last year. Mr. Elton said confidently, witnessed by Mr. Hill. I looked up at Grant. He was smirking. He had signed it as a witness. Of course he had. Judge Keene adjusted her glasses. She picked up the document and held it under the light. The room went silent. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Scarlett notices her parents nodding behind Blair. I shifted my gaze slightly. Diane and Warren were beaming. My mother leaned over and whispered something to my father, patting his arm. They looked so proud. They thought they had won. They thought this piece of paper was the smoking gun that would put me back in my place beneath them, dependent on them, grateful for their scraps. The judge turned the page. She frowned. She flipped back to the first page. She ran her finger down the text, stopping at the property description. She looked at the date at the top of the page, October 10th, 2024. Then she looked at the address, 1042 Blackwood Pass, Silver Pine Ridge. MS. Dyers, the judge said. Her voice cut through the silence. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my skirt. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked at me, then back at the paper, and then at me again. Her expression was unreadable, but the air in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, like the drop in pressure before a storm. She looked at Blair's attorney. Mr. Elton, this contract claims that MS. Dyers, as an individual, transferred rights to this property to your client. That is correct. Your Honor, Elton said, looking confused by the question. The judge turned her gaze back to me. She took off her glasses and set them down on the bench. She looked at me with a new intensity. It was not the dismissive look she had given me at the start of the hearing. It was the look of someone who had just found a puzzle piece that did not fit the box. MS. Dyers. Judge Keene said, is this property held in your name? The question hung in the air. Blair shifted in her seat. Grant stopped smiling. They were expecting me to stutter. They were expecting me to say yes or to try to explain why I had signed it. I took a deep breath. I looked directly at the judge. I did not look at Blair. I did not look at my parents. No, Your Honor, I said. My voice was soft, but it was steady. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is this held under an LLC? She asked. The room went dead silent. Mr. Elton froze. He turned his head sharply to look at me. Blair looked at her lawyer, confusion clouding her perfect face. She did not know what an LLC was. Not really. To her, business was something men did. Yes, Your Honor, I said. The judge's expression changed. The boredom vanished. Her eyes narrowed, and she picked up the contract again, looking at it with open suspicion. It was the look of a woman who had just discovered the first loose thread in a very expensive sweater. And what is the name of that entity? Judge Keene asked. I kept my eyes locked on hers. Dyers Ridge Holdings, LLC. I said. The judge looked at the contract in her hand, the contract that listed me, Scarlett Dyers, the individual as the owner, the contract that claimed to transfer a deed that I, as an individual, did not technically hold. She looked at Mr. Elton. He was flipping through his own papers frantically. And MS. Dyers, the judge continued, leaning forward, her voice dropping an octave. When was that LLC formed? 3 years ago. Your Honor, I replied, 2 years before the date on that contract. Judge Keene set the paper down. She did not drop it. She placed it down very carefully, as if it were a loaded weapon. She looked at Blair. Then she looked at Grant. And finally, she looked at me like she had just realized I was the only person in the room speaking a language she understood. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at the date on the forged document, then at the address, and then back at me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut, but the people who had said it did not realize their own legs were caught in the teeth. Blair's smile faltered. She whispered something to Grant, but he didn't answer. He was staring at the judge, and for the first time, he looked afraid. I sat back down. I folded my hands on the table. My stomach was still tight, but the panic was gone. The judge cleared her throat. It sounded like thunder. Counsel approached the bench, she said. And that was when my sister smiled at me one last time, a nervous, confused little twitch of her lips, and whispered across the aisle, "You're finished." She was wrong. I was just getting started. To understand why I sat in that courtroom with a stomach full of broken glass while my sister tried to steal my life, you have to understand that I was never the protagonist of the Whittaker family story. I was the supporting character. I was the practical daughter, the sturdy furniture in the background of Blair's shining stage play. The realization did not hit me all at once. It accumulated over 20 years, like dust settling in a room nobody ever visits. But if I had to pin it to a single moment, it was the day my parents sat me down at the kitchen table to discuss my tuition. I was 20 years old, a junior in college, maintaining a 3.88 grade average while working part-time at the campus bookstore. Blair was 22, freshly graduated with a degree in art history that she had no intention of using, and she wanted to move to the city to find herself. Finding herself, it turned out, was expensive. My father, Warren, had laid his hands flat on the table. He had this way of looking at me that made me feel like an accountant discussing a tax write-off rather than his child. He told me that they were restructuring the family budget. That was the phrase he used, restructuring. He explained that Blair had a unique opportunity to network in high society circles, but the cost of living in the city was astronomical to support her properly, to give her the launch pad she deserved. They needed to divert funds. He meant my funds. He told me that I was smart and resourceful. He said I could handle taking out student loans for my final 2 years. He called it smart budgeting. He said that Blair was delicate, that she needed a safety net, whereas I was built for the grind. I remember looking at my mother, Diane. She was busy polishing a silver spoon, refusing to meet my eyes. She just nodded and said that it was all for the greater good of the family. If Blair married well, we would all benefit. I was being asked to mortgage my future so Blair could hunt for a husband in comfort. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I just said, okay. That was who I was back then, the practical one, the one who absorbed the impact so everyone else could stay comfortable. 2 years later, the return on their investment sat at our dining room table in the form of Grant Hale. It was a celebratory dinner. The air smelled of roast beef and expensive red wine. Blair was glowing, her hand resting on Grant's forearm to show off the diamond ring that cost more than my entire student loan balance. Everyone was cheering. My father was pouring champagne, his face flushed with the kind of pride he never showed when I made the dean's list. My mother was already planning the wedding seating chart on a napkin. I was happy for her, or I tried to be. I was working 2 jobs at the time, one as an administrative assistant at a plumbing supply company and another waiting tables on weekends. I was tired down to my bones. My shoes were scuffed because I could not afford new ones, and I was renting a basement apartment that smelt perpetually of damp earth and someone else's cooking. Grant raised his glass for a toast. He made a speech about family, about legacy, about how he was going to take care of Blair in the manner to which she was accustomed. Then the conversation turned to housing. Grant and Blair were looking at estates in the hills. They were talking about square footage and guest wings. My father turned to me, his face shiny with wine. He asked me how my little apartment was. Before I could answer, he laughed. He clapped Grant on the shoulder and said that Scarlett was the free spirit of the family. He said I preferred the bohemian lifestyle of writing red checks to strangers. Then Blair chimed in. She took a sip of her champagne and giggled. She said that Scarlett would always be the renter. She said it with such casual certainty, as if it were a genetic trait, like having brown eyes or being short. She said some people were born to own the world, and some people were born to pay rent, to live in it. The table erupted in laughter. Even Grant, who barely knew me, chuckled. Something inside me fractured that night. It was a quiet break, a hairline fracture in the foundation of my loyalty. I sat there and smiled, but beneath the table my hands were clenched so tight my fingernails cut into my palms. I looked at them, my parents, my sister, her fiancé, and I realized they did not see me as a person with dreams. They saw me as a fixed point of mediocrity against which they could measure their own success. Later, that evening, while I was helping my mother clear the dishes because Blair was too exhausted from being celebrated, I tried to talk to my father one last time. I told him I had been reading about real estate. I told him I wanted to learn how to invest, maybe buy a small fixer-upper instead of renting forever. I asked him for advice. He did not even look up from his brandy. He waved his hand dismissively and told me to stick to what I knew. He said real estate was a man's game. He said it required nerves of steel and capital I did not have. He laughed and said I should focus on finding a husband like Grant if I wanted a house, because that was the only way a girl like me would ever get her name on a deed. That was the moment the practical daughter died and the invisible investor was born. I made a vow that night as I drove back to my damp basement apartment. I vowed that I would never ask them for anything ever again. No more begging, no more permission. I would build something that nobody could take away from me. And I would do it in the dark where they could not criticize it, sabotage it, or claim it as their own. I started the very next day. I did not have capital, but I had the one thing they thought was my weakness. I knew how to suffer. I knew how to work while they slept. My education began in the public library. I could not afford seminars or gurus, so I went to the source. I spent every free evening surrounded by stacks of books that smelled of dust and old glue. I read everything. I read about landlord-tenant laws until I could recite statutes by memory. I studied tax codes, learning the difference between depreciation and capital gains. I taught myself the basics of zoning, how to read a survey, and how to spot a structural defect in a foundation. I treated it like a second religion. While Blair was planning her wedding, stressing over the shade of white for the napkins, I was learning how to calculate cash-on-cash returns. While my parents were bragging about their new son-in-law, I was learning how to form a limited liability company to protect assets from liability. But knowledge without money was just theory. I needed cash. I became a machine. I kept my day job at the plumbing supply company because it gave me steady income and, more importantly, it taught me the cost of materials. I learned how much copper piping should cost. I learned the markup on water heaters. I made friends with the contractors who came in, listening to them complain about clients, and filed away every tick they gave me. At night, I waited tables at a high-end steakhouse. It was grueling work. My feet swelled until they throbbed and my back itched constantly. I served people like Grant and Blair, people who snapped their fingers for service and tipped based on their mood. I swallowed my pride 1,000 times a night. Every rude comment, every stiff tip, every look of disdain only fueled me. I took every dollar I made, every single one, and put it into a separate high-yield savings account I had opened at a bank across town where my parents did not bank. I did not stop there. I took side gigs on the weekends. I transcribed audio files for pennies a minute. I cleaned houses for a legitimate agency on Saturday mornings, scrubbing toilets and mansions that belonged to people my parents desperately wanted to be friends with. I saw the reality of wealth, the dirt behind the golden faucets. It demystified the world for me. I stopped seeing houses as magical castles and started seeing them as assets composed of wood, glass, and maintenance schedules. I lived on rice, beans, and discounted vegetables. I wore my clothes until they fell apart and then mended them. I cut my own hair. I stopped going to family events, claiming I was working overtime, which was true. They did not mind. My absence just meant more attention for Blair. They thought I was struggling to keep my head above water. They had no idea I was building a raft. It took me 4 years of relentless grinding discipline, 4 years of missing birthdays, skipping holidays, and sleeping 5 hours a night. But finally I had enough. It was not a mountain home. It was not a luxury retreat. It was a terrifyingly ugly duplex on the edge of a transitional neighborhood. The siding was peeling. The roof was questionable, and the lawn was a jumble of weeds, but the numbers worked. I had run them 100 times. I remember sitting in the title company office to sign the closing papers. My hand shook as I held the pen. I was terrified. I was risking every cent I had saved on a building that looked like it might collapse if the wind blew too hard. But then I remembered my father's laugh. I remembered the renter joke. I signed my name Scarlett Dyers. I did not tell them. I did not post a picture on social media. I did not call my mother to celebrate. I drove to the property, unlocked the front door, and stood in the empty, smelly living room. It smelled of stale cigarettes and cat litter, but to me it smelled like freedom. I sat on the floor and cried, not out of sadness, but out of sheer, overwhelming relief. I owned this. It was mine. I spent the next 6 months rehabbing it myself. I learned to tile bathrooms by watching videos on the internet. I painted until my hands were permanently stained. I tore out carpets and refinished floors. I rented the other half to a quiet nurse who paid her rent on the first of the month like clockwork. When that first rent check hit my account, I felt a rush of adrenaline better than any drug. It was proof the system worked. I kept the secret for years. I let them believe I was still the struggling administrative assistant. I let them buy dinner when we met, listening to their patronizing advice about how I should try to find a better job. I played the part of the poor relation perfectly. But the memory that haunts me, the one that played on a loop in my head as I sat in that courtroom, happened just before the lawsuit began. It was a rare family gathering I actually attended. Blair was complaining about her kitchen renovation, about how the contractor was charging too much. She looked at me sitting quietly in the corner and sighed. She told me I was lucky I did not have to deal with the stress of ownership. She said renting was so much simpler. Then she smiled, that sweet, venomous smile she reserved just for me. She walked over and patted my cheek. She told me not to worry about my future. She said that she and Grant had discussed it. They would make sure I was taken care of when I got old. After all, she said, family is family. And then she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper, unaware of the empire I had already built, unaware of the deeds in my safe, unaware of the LLCs I controlled. Whatever you build, Scarlett, she said, it will end up in the family anyway. You know you are not capable of managing real wealth. It always flows to the people who know how to use it. She walked away laughing, reaching for another glass of wine. She thought she was comforting me. She thought she was promising me charity. She did not realize she was declaring war. She did not know that she had just given me the final motivation I needed to ensure that not one single brick, not one single dollar would ever touch her hands. That was the fuel. That was the fire. And as I sat in court listening to her lawyer call me reckless, I remembered the smell of bleach on my hands from cleaning other people's toilets to buy my freedom. I remembered the night sleeping in my car outside a job site to guard materials. I remembered the sacrifice. They thought they were taking a vacation home from a lucky little sister. They had no idea they were trying to rob a woman who had forged herself in the fires of their own neglect. They were about to find out that the practical daughter had learned a few new tricks. I stopped looking at houses as homes. That was the first rule of my new life. A home is where you hang pictures and argue about paint colors. A property is a machine. It has inputs, mortgage, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and it has outputs, rent, appreciation, tax benefits. If the output is higher than the input, the machine works. If it is not, you starve. My education moved from the library to the streets. I replaced novels with spreadsheets. I learned to love the unsexy vocabulary of wealth, cash flow, capitalization rates, debt, service coverage ratios. I realized that my family's idea of money was entirely performative. To them, money was something you wore or drove. To me, money became soldiers. I sent them out to capture more territory, and I did not let them sleep. The first step in protecting this new army was anonymity. I knew that if my family saw my name on a deed, they would sniff around like sharks sensing blood in the water. They would see it as a quirk, then a resource, and finally an obligation to share. So I created a shield. I filed the paperwork for Dyer's Ridge Holdings, LLC. It cost me $300 to file, and I hesitated before clicking submit. It felt like a lot of money at the time. I chose the name carefully. Dyer's for my grandmother, the only person in the family who had ever been kind to me before she passed. Ridge because it sounded solid, immovable. It sounded like a corporate conglomerate run by faceless men in gray suits, not a single woman eating instant oatmeal for dinner. When the stamped articles of organization arrived in the mail, I stared at them for an hour. I was no longer just Scarlett, the secretary. I was an entity. I leveraged the equity from that first duplex to buy a small retail strip on the edge of town. It was ugly. It was a flat beige concrete block housing a struggling laundromat and a vape shop. Blair would have driven past it and sneered. I parked across the street and counted the foot traffic. I counted the cars. I saw workers coming off the night shift needing clean clothes. I saw a steady stream of customers. The building was ugly, but the numbers were beautiful. I bought it. I raised the rent slightly, but added value immediately. Better lighting in the parking lot, fresh paint, fixed the pothole that had been swallowing tires for years. The tenants stayed. The checks cleared. Then came the brick building on 4th Street. This was supposed to be my crown jewel. It was a 3-story mixed-use building in a historic district that was just starting to turn around. The brickwork was intricate. The windows were tall, and the price was suspiciously low. I thought I had found a steal. I hired a licensed inspector. He walked through with a clipboard, tapped the walls, checked the electrical panel, and gave me a thumbs up. He called it a solid old girl with good bones. I trusted him. I put down $40,000 of my hard-earned cash, every penny of liquidity I had available, and signed the mortgage for the rest. 2 weeks after closing, I was in the basement with a flashlight, planning where to put new storage lockers. I saw a strange discoloration on the main support beam, hidden behind a stack of old shelving the previous owner had left behind. I pulled the shelving away. My heart stopped. The wood crumbled in my hand like wet cake. Termites, and not just a few. It looked like an entire colony had been feasting on the structural integrity of my building for a decade. The beam was not supporting anything. It was a ghost of a beam. I called 3 contractors. The first one looked at it, whistled low, and told me the whole building was a stiff wind away from collapsing. He quoted me $60,000 to shore it up and replace the damage. $60,000. I went to my car and dry heaved. I had $4,000 in the bank. I was leveraged to the hilt. If I could not fix this, the city would condemn the building. I would lose the tenants. I would default on the mortgage. I would lose the retail strip. I would lose the duplex. I would be back in the basement. And Blair would be right. I sat there for 20 minutes, listening to the traffic rush by, feeling the cold clamp of failure around my throat. I could hear my father's voice laughing, calling it a man's game. Then the panic turned into something cold and hard. No, I wiped my mouth. I did not go home. I went to the city planning office. I pulled the original blueprints from 1920. I went to the library and checked out books on structural engineering and timber framing. I spent 3 nights without sleep, learning exactly how load distribution worked. I realized I did not need to lift the whole building at once. I could do it in sections. I did not need the gold-plated construction firm with the fancy wrapped trucks. I needed hungry guys who knew how to use hydraulic jacks. I called a different kind of contractor, a guy named Russo, who ran a small crew and drove a truck that looked like it had been in a demolition derby. I met him at the property. I did not ask him what he thought. I told him what we were going to do. I want to jack the south corner first, I said, my voice steady, masking the terror. We use temporary steel posts here, here, and here. We cut the rut out in 4 FT sections. We sister the new beams with steel plates. I source the steel myself. You provide the labor and the jacks. Russell looked at me. He was a man who had likely been ignoring women's opinions on construction his whole life. He looked at the beam, then back at me. He chewed on a toothpick. You sourced the steel? He asked. I get it from the salvage yard across the river. I said I'd already called them. They have I-beams from the old factory tiered down. Cents on the dollar. Russell cracked a smile. It was missing the tooth. 25,000, he said. Cash 18, I countered. And I pay you in 3 installments, start, middle, and finish. We settled on 20,000. I sold my car to pay the first installment. I took the bus to my day job for 3 months. I spent every evening at that building, wearing a hard hat and boots, watching every cut, every weld, every bolt. I learned the smell of ozone from the welding torches. I learned how to mix concrete. I learned that disaster is just a math problem you haven't solved yet. When the job was done, the building was stronger than it had been the day it was built. Russell shook my hand. He didn't call me sweetheart or honey like the other guys. He called me boss. That was the turning point. I stopped being a girl playing with houses and became an operator. I began to specialize in the things nobody else wanted. I bought the house with the fire damage that smelled like smoke. I bought the commercial unit with the cracked foundation. I bought the ugly, the broken, the ignored. The city inspectors started to recognize me. They knew that when Dyer's Ridge Holdings filed a permit, the work would be done right. I did not cut corners because I could not afford to be sued. My portfolio grew, but my lifestyle did not. This was the discipline that saved me. When I flipped a property for $50,000 profit, I did not buy a Mercedes. I bought 2 more roofs. When the cash flow from the apartments hit $10,000 a month, I did not move into a penthouse. I stayed in my small apartment, drove a used Honda, and shopped at discount grocery stores. To my family, I was still the same struggling Scarlet. They saw my old car and assumed I was failing. They saw my work boots in the trunk and assumed I was doing manual labor because I wasn't smart enough for office work. Poor Scarlet, my mother would say at holidays, handing me leftovers in Tupperware containers as if I were a charity case. "You look so tired. Are you eating enough?" "I am doing fine, Mom," I would say, thinking about the 4 building I had just closed on that morning. I reinvested everything. It is amazing how much money you can accumulate when you don't care about impressing people. It is a snowball effect. The first million is a war. The second is a strategy. But it wasn't just about the money. There was a part of me that still needed to prove, if only to myself, that I wasn't just a machine. There was a small, dilapidated theater on the east side of town, the Arts Annex. It was a tiny black box venue where local poets and jazz musicians performed. It was the kind of place that smelled of old velvet and cheap coffee, but it had a soul. The developer next door wanted to bulldoze it to expand a parking lot. I heard about it through the grapevine. The city was going to foreclose on it for back taxes. The amount was trivial to a developer, but insurmountable for the nonprofit running it. I did not want the parking lot. I set up a separate trust, totally blind, layered behind 2 other LLCs. I paid the back taxes the day before the auction. I set up a lease agreement that charged the nonprofit $1 a year for the next 99 years. I never went inside to introduce myself. I never took a boat. I stood across the street one rainy Tuesday night and watched the lights come on. I watched a group of college kids walking in carrying instrument cases, laughing. They had no idea that the woman in the raincoat standing at the bus stop was the reason they still had a stage. It felt better than any check I had ever deposited. It was power, real power, the power to preserve something beautiful without asking for applause. My family operated on noise. They needed validation. Lair needed Instagram likes. Brand needed people to admire his suits. My parents needed social standing. They were loud, and because they were loud, they were vulnerable. I learned that silence is security. If nobody knows what you have, nobody can try to take it from you. If nobody knows you are the king, nobody tries to cut off your head. So I let them talk. I let Blair brag about her vacations. I let Grant lecture me on smart investing while he leveraged their house to buy a boat he used twice a year. I sat at their tables, ate their food, and nodded like a good little sister. All the while, Dyer's Ridge Holdings was quietly swallowing the city block by block. I was building a fortress. And the best part was to the people who wanted to hurt me most. It looked like I was digging a ditch. But I knew one thing for certain. Eventually, the truth comes out. And when it did, I wanted to be standing on high ground. I just didn't realize that the battleground would be a courtroom, and the weapon they would use against me would be my own success, twisted into a lie. I was ready for the market to crash. I was ready for tenants to sue. I was ready for fires and floods. But as I signed the deed for the mountain house in Silver Pine Ridge, the first thing I had ever bought purely for myself, purely for joy, I made my first mistake. I let my guard down. I let them see it. And sharks, as I should have remembered, can smell a single drop of blood from a mile away. The collapse of my carefully constructed privacy did not begin with a bang. It began with a digital chirp from my phone on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my office, a small repurposed bedroom in my apartment, reviewing the heating bills for the triplex on Elm Street. The world was quiet. My systems were running. The invisible empire was humming along, unseen and undisturbed. Then an alert popped up on my screen. It was a Google alert I had set years ago for Silver Pine Ridge, mostly to keep track of zoning changes or local crime reports. This alert was different. It linked to a website called The Gilded Weekend, a digital magazine that catered to people who bought $400 candles and considered brunch a personality trait. The headline read, "Top 10 Hidden Winter Escapes for the Discerning Traveler." My stomach turned over before I even clicked the link. I scrolled down past a chalet in Aspen and a glass cube in Iceland, and there at number 4 was my house. The photo was unauthorized. It must have been taken from the hiking trail that ran along the ridge above the property line. The photographer had used a telephoto lens to capture the A-frame rising out of the snow, the cedar deck gleaming in the winter sun, and the smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. The caption did not name me, thank God, but it described the property with breathless adoration. A masterclass in modern rustic design. This private residence in Silver Pine Ridge proves that true luxury is silence. Rumored to be owned by a private investor, it is the ultimate fortress of solitude. My heart hammered against my ribs. To a stranger, it was just a pretty picture. To my family who knew I had been spending weekends in Silver Pine Ridge camping, it was a signal flare. I debated calling the website to demand they take it down, but I knew the Striern defect. Making a fuss would only draw more attention. I closed the laptop, hoping that Blair was too busy planning her next spa trip to read articles about winter escapes. I was wrong. The call came the next afternoon. I saw Blair's name on the caller ID and let it ring 3 times. I needed to compose my voice. I needed to find the frequency of the dull, struggling sister they preferred. "Hey, Blair," I answered, cradling the phone between my shoulder and ear while I organized receipts. "What is going on?" "Hey, you," she said. Her voice was dripping with sugar, a sure sign that she wanted something. "I was just scrolling through the Gilded Weekend, you know, looking for ideas for Grant's birthday, and I saw something so cute." I stopped moving. I stared at the wall. "Oh," I said. "Yeah," she continued, the sweetness stretching thin. "Number 4 on their list. It looks exactly like that little spot you said you bought. The one you said was a fixer-upper." She paused. It was a trap. If I denied it, she would drive up there to check. If I admitted it, the game changed. "It is the same place," I said, keeping my voice flat. "They made it look better than it is. It is just good lighting." There was a silence on the other end, a long calculating silence. "Scarlett," she said, and her tone dropped the sugary act. "That does not look like a fixer-upper. That looks like a $2 million estate. It is not an estate." "Blair," I said, feeling the defensive heat rising in my neck. "It is a house. I fixed it up myself. You know I do that." "Why did you lie?" she asked. "I did not lie," I said. "I just did not brag. You are alone, Scarlett." She said the judgment was instantaneous. "Why would you hoard a family home like that? It has 4 bedrooms. I checked the county records online. 4 bedrooms, and you are just one person." The phrase family home hit me like a slap. It was not a family home. It was my home. I paid the mortgage. I paid the taxes. I fixed the roof when it leaked. "It is an investment, Blair," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "And it is my retreat. I like the quiet." "It is selfish," she snapped. The mask was fully off now. "Grant and I have been looking for a place to host the winter gala. Mom and Dad have been saying they need fresh air for their health, and you are sitting on a luxury lodge, heaping it empty because you want to play hermit." "I am not playing hermit," I said firmly. "I am living my life, and the house is not available for galas." "Do not make me the bad guy here, Scarlett," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that sounded dangerously close to a tantrum. "Do not make me the bad guy for taking what is fair. We are family. You do not shut family out." I hung up. My hand was shaking. Taking what is fair. That was the phrase that stuck in her mind. My success was a resource she had a natural right to harvest because I was single, because I was the little sister. My property was common ground. The coordination began 48 hours later. It was too fast to be organic. It was a strategy session executed via telephone. First, it was my mother. She called while I was driving to a site inspection. "Scarlett." "Honey," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured frailty. "Blair tells me you are upset. She was just trying to reconnect. You know how much she loves the mountains. She is not trying to reconnect." "Mom," I said, "she wants to use my house for a party." "Is that so terrible?" she asked. "Be generous, Scarlett. You have done so well for yourself. Better than we thought. Apparently, it is ugly to keep things to yourself. Do it for the family. We could all use a vacation together. Imagine how nice that would be." I gripped the steering wheel. It would not be nice. It would be me cooking and cleaning while they criticized the decor, and Grant drank my wine. No, Mom, I said. Then came my father. He did not call. He left a voicemail. His voice was gruff, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. Scarlett, this is your father. Stop being difficult. Blair is under a lot of stress. If you have a resource that can help the family, you share it. That is how we raised you. You are being selfish and it does not look good on you. Call your sister and apologize. I deleted the voicemail. I did not call back. I thought I could just weather the storm. I thought if I just said no enough times, they would get bored and move on to a new target. But then came the text from Grant. It arrived on a Friday night at 11:00. Grant never texted me. We had not spoken directly in 6 months. The message popped up on my lock screen, glowing in the dark room. We know the LLC is yours. Stop playing games. We just want what is promised. Signed something simple giving us access. Avoid court. I stared at the words avoid court. The blood drained from my face. Why would he mention court? We were arguing about a vacation weekend. Normal families argue about keys and dates. They do not threaten litigation over a borrowed cabin. Unless it wasn't about a borrowed cabin, Grant was a businessman. A failing one, perhaps, but he knew how leverage worked. He knew that the only reason to threaten court was if you thought you had a legal standing to win, but they had no standing. The deed was in my LLC. The LLC was in my name. There was no agreement. That was when the cold realization washed over me. There was no agreement yet. If they were threatening court, they had to have something to show a judge. And if I hadn't signed anything, that meant they were manufacturing something. I didn't sleep that night. I paced my apartment, checking the locks, feeling like the walls were closing in. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was a hostile takeover. The next morning, I drove to the city to see Elliot Hayes. Elliot was not a family law attorney in the cuddly sense. He was a shark who wore rumpled suits and operated out of a building that smelled of old cigars and victory. I had used him for a difficult eviction 2 years ago, and I respected him because he didn't like small talk. I sat in his office surrounded by stacks of case files and told him everything. I showed him the article. I played the voicemail for my father. I showed him Grant's text. Elliot leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. They are not asking for a vacation. Scarlett, he said. His voice was growly and calm. This is an acquisition strategy. But why, I asked, feeling the desperate need for logic. Why can they not just be happy I succeeded? Elliot laughed a dry, humorless sound. Family does not work like that when money is involved, he said, especially not when the dynamic shifts. You were the subordinate. You were the safety net they stood on. Now you are the ceiling, and they are hitting their heads. They do not want peace. They want control. He picked up Grant's text message and read it again. Avoid court, he repeated. That is a specific threat. It implies they have a cause of action. Tell me, did you ever send them an email promising them the house? A text, a birthday card where you said, my house is your house? No, I said never. I have been extremely careful. Elliot nodded. Then we have to assume the worst. If the evidence does not exist, they might create it. My stomach dropped. You mean forgery? It happens more often than you think, Elliot said, especially with desperate people who feel entitled. They convince themselves that you meant to give it to them. So writing it down for you is just helping you do the right thing. They rationalize the crime before they even commit it. He sat forward, his eyes hard. Here is the plan, he said. We go dark. You do not respond to texts. You do not pick up calls. We build a firewall around you. He grabbed a yellow legal pad and started writing a list. 1, he said, we pull a full title report on every property you own, not just the mountain house. We make sure there are no liens or claims you do not know about. 2, he continued, we document everything, save every voicemail, screenshot every text. I want a timeline of every interaction you have had with them regarding money for the last 10 years. 3, he said, looking up at me, we prepare for a fraud defense. We get samples of your signature from official documents over the last 5 years. If they produce a piece of paper with your name on it, I want to be able to prove within an hour that you did not sign it." He tore the sheet off the pad and slid it across the desk to me. "Scarlett," he said softly, "this is going to get ugly. They are going to attack your character. They are going to call you unstable. They are going to try to make you look incompetent so they can step in as guardians of your assets. It is a common playbook." I looked at the list. It felt like a war plan. "I am ready," I said, but my voice sounded small in the room. Elliot shook his head. "You are not ready," he said. "You are still thinking like a sister. You are wondering why they are doing this. You need to stop asking why and start asking how. Because once they file that lawsuit, they are not your family anymore. They are the plaintiff." I walked out of his office into the bright afternoon sunlight, but the world felt darker than it had an hour ago. I looked at my phone. There were 3 new messages from my mother. "Why are you ignoring us? We just want to talk. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I turned the phone off. I drove home in silence, watching the rear view mirror, checking to see if anyone was following me. The paranoia had set in, but as I merged onto the highway, a new feeling began to rise beneath the fear. It was anger. Cold, hard, structural anger. They wanted the house fine. They could come for it, but they had no idea that they were walking into a fortress designed by the very person they had underestimated for 30 years. I wasn't the practical daughter anymore. I was the CEO of Dyer's Ridge Holdings, and I was about to teach them a lesson in ownership. The knock on my door came on a Sunday morning. It was not a polite neighborly rap. It was a firm, bureaucratic thud that demanded attention. I was drinking coffee and reviewing a lease agreement for the retail strip, enjoying the only quiet hours I had left. When I opened the door, a man I had never seen before stood there. He was wearing a generic windbreaker and held a thick envelope. He asked if I was Scarlett Dyers. When I nodded, he thrust the envelope into my hands, mumbled a statutory phrase about being served, and walked away without looking back. I closed the door and locked it. The envelope felt heavy, heavier than paper should be. It felt like I was holding a brick. I sat down at my kitchen table and tore it open. Blair Whittaker versus Scarlett Dyers. It was real. They had actually done it. I spent the next hour reading the complaint, and with every page, the cold sensation in my gut turned into a burning nausea. The lawsuit did not just claim that I had promised them the house. It claimed that I was incapable of owning it. The narrative they had constructed was terrifyingly detailed. Blair's attorney had painted a picture of a woman who was emotionally volatile, financially erratic, and prone to episodes of impulsive decision. They cited my lack of a traditional career as evidence of instability. They claimed that the purchase of the Silver Pine Ridge property was a manic episode that the family had to intervene in to save me from bankruptcy. According to this fiction, the share asset agreement was not just a gift. It was a rescue mission. Blair was positioning herself not as a thief but as a steward. I put the papers down and walked to the window. My hands were trembling. I realized then that Elliot was right. This was not about a vacation home. If a judge believed I was mentally unstable, if they established a legal precedent that I was incompetent, they could come for everything. They could petition for guardianship. They could take control of Dyer's Ridge Holdings. They could seize the empire I had built brick by brick and liquidate it to fund their galas and luxury cars. They were not trying to evict me from a house. They were trying to evict me from my own life. I tried to call my parents. I needed to hear their voices. I needed to know if they truly signed off on this cruelty. My mother answered on the second ring. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking, "have you read what Blair filed? She is saying I am crazy. She is saying I am incompetent." There was a pause. I could hear breathing on the other line. I could hear the faint sound of the television in the background. "Scarlett," my mother said. Her voice was stiff, devoid of any warmth. It sounded like she was reading from a script. "We have been advised not to discuss the details of the pending litigation with you. We just want what is best for the family." "Mom, please," I begged. "This is me. This is your daughter. Do you really believe I am unstable? I own 10 properties. I have a perfect credit score. We hope you will do the right thing and settle." "Scarlett," she said, repeating the line with mechanical precision, "it is for your own protection." She hung up. I stared at the phone. My father did not even answer his cell. He just let it go to voicemail. The message of rejection was absolute. They had chosen their side, and they had chosen their narrative. I was the problem that needed to be managed. 2 days later, the settlement offer arrived on Elliot's desk. I sat in his office while he read it. He let out a low, cynical whistle. "They are generous," he said sarcastically. "They are offering to drop the lawsuit if you sign a consent decree granting the Whittaker family 50% ownership of the Silver Pine Ridge property, lifetime exclusive usage rights for the months of December, January, and July. And, this is the kicker, grant Blair power of attorney over the property's financial management to ensure its solvency." I felt the blood drain from my face. "So they want to own it, use it during the best months and control the bank account," I said. "And I get to pay the mortgage and handle the repairs." "Essentially," Elliot said, tossing the document onto his desk. "It is a bullet offer. They are banking on the fact that you are scared of a public trial. They think you will fold to avoid the embarrassment of having your mental health debated in open court." "I am not folding," I said. My voice was quiet, but the shake was gone. "Good," Elliot said, "because now we start the discovery process. If they want to fight, we are going to give them a war." The weeks that followed were a blur of paranoia and paperwork. I felt like I was being watched every time I left my apartment. I started taking different routes to my properties. I checked my rear view mirror constantly. I stopped going to the grocery store and started ordering delivery, leaving instructions for the driver to leave the bags at the door. Elliot began requesting documents from Blair's side. He wanted the original of the alleged contract. He wanted text messages, emails, and phone records. When the initial batch of discovery came back, Elliot called me in. He looked like a hunter who had just found a fresh track. "Look at the witness list," he said, pointing to a page. I scanned the names. There were 5 people listed. I recognized 3 of them. They were Blair's friends from her country club, women I had met maybe twice in my life. The other 2 were business associates of Grant. "They are going to testify to your erratic behavior," Elliot said. "They are going to say you looked stressed at a party 3 years ago, or that you said something confusing at a brunch. It is all hearsay and character assassination, but look at the dates they claim these events happened." He pointed to a timeline he had drawn on a whiteboard. "They claim you had a public breakdown about money on June 12th of last year," he said. I frowned. "June 12th? I was in Chicago taking a seminar on commercial zoning laws." "Exactly," Elliot said. "We have your flight records and your hotel receipt. They are lying scarlet. And they are sloppy." But the centerpiece of their case was the contract. They finally produced a high-resolution color copy of the shared asset agreement. I stared at it. It looked so official. It had a notary stamp from a man named Marcus P. Reynolds. "Who is Marcus Reynolds?" I asked. "We are looking into him," Elliot said. But here is the interesting part. The formatting of this document, the font, the margins, the legal boilerplate language. It is identical to a template you can download from a generic legal website for $20. But look at the page numbers. I looked page 1 of 4, page 2 of 4. The font on the page numbers is different from the font in the body text. Elliot said it is subtle, maybe half a point size difference, but it suggests that this document was assembled from different sources. Maybe page 1 was printed on a different day, and page 3. We need an expert. I said I hired a forensic document examiner named Dr. Aries Thorne. He was expensive, costing me $400 an hour, but he was the best in the state. I met him in a small sterile office that smelled of ozone and magnifying glass cleaner. I did not tell my family. I did not tell anyone. I paid him from an account that was not linked to my main operating funds. I also hired a digital analyst to scrub the metadata of every email and file they sent over. I was building a counter-surveillance unit. Grant tried to corner me a week later. I was leaving the county clerk's office where I had been pulling my own records to double-check everything. He was waiting by the parking meters, leaning against his car, checking his watch. It was not a coincidence. He had been following me. "Scarlett," he called out. I kept walking, clutching my file folder to my chest. "Scarlett, "Stop being dramatic," he said, falling into step beside me. He was wearing his expensive sunglasses, looking every inch the successful developer he pretended to be. I stopped and turned to face him. I made sure to stand in full view of the security cameras mounted on the courthouse exterior. "What do you want, Grant?" I asked. "We just want what you promised," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of fake confusion. "Why are you acting so guilty if the contract is real? Why are you fighting it? Just sign the settlement. We can all go back to being a happy family." "There is no happy family, Grant," I said. "You sued me. You called me crazy in a public record. We did what we had to do to protect the asset," he said smoothly. "You know you get overwhelmed. Scarlett, you take on too much. Blair is just trying to help you carry the load." "Help me?" I laughed, a harsh sound. "You want to steal $2 million property because you're broke, Grant." His smile vanished. His jaw tightened. He took a step closer, invading my personal space. "Be careful, Scarlett," he hissed. "You are playing a game you do not understand. We have witnesses. We have the document. You are going to lose, and when you do, the judge is going to put you under a conservatorship. You will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without our permission." I looked him in the eye. I saw the fear behind the aggression. He was desperate. "Get out of my way," I said. I drove straight to my office, not the apartment, but a small rental unit in one of my buildings that I used for storage. I locked the door. I pulled out every file I had. I pulled out the copy of the forged contract. I sat there for 6 hours. I read every word. I checked every date. I cross-referenced every sentence with my own records. It was 2:00 in the morning when I found it. My eyes were burning. I was drinking cold coffee. I was looking at the first paragraph of the contract, the part that defined the parties involved. It read, "This agreement is made between Blair Whittaker, plaintiff, and Scarlett Dyers, acting as the sole member and manager of Dyers Ridge Holdings, LLC." I read it again. Dyers Ridge Holdings, LLC. I looked at the date at the top of the contract. The date, they claimed we signed it, July 14th, 2023. I froze. A jolt of electricity shot down my spine. I scrambled through my filing cabinet, my hands shaking so hard I dropped a folder. I found the Articles of Organization for my LLC, the official stamped document from the Secretary of State. I looked at the date of formation, September 21st, 2023. I let out a breath that sounded like a sob. They had forged the contract and backdated it to July to make it look like the gift happened before the property increased in value over the winter. But they made a fatal error. They included the name of my LLC because they knew the house was currently held in it. But on July 14th, Dyers Ridge Holdings, LLC did not exist. It was impossible for me to sign a contract on behalf of an entity that had not yet been born. I could not have known the name. I could not have acted as a manager for a ghost. They had guessed the timeline. They assumed I had formed the LLC when I bought the land, but I hadn't. I had bought the land in my own name first and transferred it to the LLC months later for liability protection. They were caught. I picked up the phone and called Elliot, ignoring the time. "Elliot," I whispered, staring at the two documents side by side. "I got them." "Scarlett," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "What time is it?" "The contract is impossible, Elliot," I said, my voice gaining strength. "They claim I signed for the LLC in July, but I did not create the LLC until September." There was silence on the line. Then I heard the rustle of bed sheets and the click of a lamp turning on. "Say that again," Elliot said, his voice suddenly sharp and awake. I repeated it. I heard him start to laugh. It was a low, dark laugh of victory. "That is it," he said. "That is the smoking gun. If that entity did not exist on the date of the signature, the document is a fabrication on its face. It is not just a contract dispute anymore. Scarlett, it is fraud on the court. It is a felony." I looked at the papers in front of me. I looked at Grant's threat in my mind. "Why are you acting guilty?" I wasn't acting guilty. I was acting like an executioner waiting for the right moment to drop the blade. "Do not tell them," Elliot said. "Do not file a motion to dismiss yet." "Why not?" I asked. "Because we want them to lie under oath. Elliot said, "We want Blair to stand up in court and swear that she saw you sign that document on that date. We want Grant to swear he witnessed it. We want them to commit to the lie completely. And then when there is no way back, we show the judge the calendar." I leaned back in my chair. The fear was gone. The paranoia evaporated. I looked at the forged signature on the page. It looked like my name, but it wasn't. It was an artifact of their greed, and now it was their death warrant. "Let them talk," I said to the empty room. "Let them scream." I closed the file. Finally, after weeks of dread, I turned off the light and went home to sleep. The conference room at Elliot's firm became our war room. It was no longer a place for client comfort. It was a staging ground for a tactical strike. We pushed the leather chairs against the wall and covered the mahogany table with boxes, timelines, and flowcharts. The air smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Elliot did not just hire a forensic expert. He assembled a clean team. This was a specific term he used. He wanted a group of professionals who had never worked together, who had no connection to me or the local courts, and whose findings would be unimpeachable. First, there was Dr. Aries Thorne, the document examiner I had already met. He brought in a spectral comparator, a machine that looked like something from a hospital lab. He was going to analyze the ink density and the paper fibers of the original contract once we forced Blair to hand it over. Then there was a digital forensic specialist named Sarah. She was 24 years old, wore a hoodie, and spoke faster than I could think. Her job was to tear apart the metadata of the digital files Blair's team had sent during discovery. She was looking for the digital fingerprints when the files were created, who created them, and most importantly, if they had been altered. Finally, we brought in a title chain verification expert. He was a retired county clerk who knew the history of every plot of land in the district going back 50 years. His job was to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the timeline of ownership my family was presenting was a legal impossibility. While they worked, I had my own job. I had to weaponize my history. I drove to my secure storage unit and retrieved the master portfolio. This was not a shoebox of receipts. This was a system I had refined over a decade. I carried the heavy banker's boxes into Elliot's office and set them down. "What is this?" Elliot asked, eyeing the color-coded labels. "This is everything," I said. I opened the first box. Inside were binders for every property I owned. Each binder contained the deed, the insurance policy, the inspection reports, the contractor invoices, the tax returns, and a log of every tenant interaction. It was immaculate. It was obsessive. "Blair says I am erratic," I said, running my hand over the plastic covers. "She says I am financially reckless." Elliot pulled out a binder labeled Imberlite Commons. He flipped through the pages. He saw the projected budgets versus the actual costs. He saw the capitalization rate calculations. He saw the email correspondence with city zoning officials, all polite, professional, and lucid. He looked up at me, and for the first time he smiled with genuine admiration. "This is not the file of a reckless person," he said. "This is the file of a Fortune 500 CFO. We are going to enter all of this into evidence." I said, "If they want to talk about my character, let us talk about my work." But we had to be careful. Elliot warned me that they would try to subpoena my medical records. They wanted to find a therapist note or a prescription for anxiety medication. Anything they could twist to fit their narrative of a breakdown. We filed a protective order immediately. We argued that my private health records were irrelevant to a property dispute. Elliot was fierce about this. He told the judge in a preliminary hearing that being a private person was not a symptom of mental illness, and seeking therapy was a sign of responsibility, not incompetence. The judge agreed to seal them. That was our first small victory. They could not touch my mind, so they would have to attack my actions. Then a surprise ally emerged from the shadows. I received an email on my secure server. It was from a woman named Alina Vance. I knew the name immediately. She was the director of historic preservation for the city. We had never met in person, but we had exchanged dozens of emails regarding the facade restoration of the Lyric Royale Theatre. She knew me only as the manager of the LLC that saved the building. The subject line read, "I think I know who you are." My heart stopped. I hesitated before opening it. Dear MS. Dyers. The email began. I was reviewing the public docket for civil cases this week. It is a habit of mine to watch for property disputes involving historic zones. I saw the filing against you regarding the Silver Pine Ridge property. I noticed the plaintiff is Blair Whittaker. I went to high school with Blair. I know how she operates. I also noticed that the address in the lawsuit falls under the Silver Pine Conservation easement. I am not sure if your legal team is aware, but that property has strict covenants regarding commercial use and heavy traffic. If the plaintiffs are claiming they have rights to use it for family events, they might be admitting to a violation of the conservation deed. I have attached the original covenant from 1998. Use it. I sat back in my chair, stunned. I had saved the theater anonymously to avoid attention, but that very anonymity had earned me silent respect. Eleanor Vance did not know my face, but she knew my work, and she knew my sister. She had chosen a side. I printed the attachment. It was gold. The Silver Pine Ridge House sat on land that was part of a protected watershed. The deed restriction explicitly forbade commercial gatherings, large-scale events, or excessive vehicular traffic that could damage the local flora. Blair had told me on the phone she wanted to host a winter gala. She wanted to bring 50 cars and a catering crew up a delicate mountain road. If she admitted that in court, if she stated on the record that her intent was to use the property for large family gatherings, she would be admitting to a conspiracy to violate a federal conservation easement. She would not just lose the house, she would trigger massive fines. I showed it to Elliot. He laughed, and this time it was a genuine belly-shaking laugh. She has no idea. He said she thinks it is just a party house. She is walking into a minefield. But the investigation took a darker turn a few days later. Sarah, our digital analyst, flagged something in the communication logs between Blair's attorney, Mr. Elton, and Grant. It was a metadata mismatch on a PDF. Scarlett, look at this. Sarah said, pointing to her monitor. This is an email Grant sent to Elton attached with a summary of assets. Look at the creation date of the file. It was created 3 days before they filed the lawsuit. Grant is feeding his own lawyer false information. Sarah said Elton thinks he is fighting for a righteous cause. He thinks these documents are real. Grant is manufacturing evidence and passing it to his attorney as fact. This was dangerous. If Elton realized he was being used to commit fraud, he would withdraw. We did not want him to withdraw yet. We wanted him to walk into that courtroom confident. We wanted him to present the lies so we could crush them. Let him believe it. Elliot said the more confident Elton is, the harder he will fall. And when he realizes his clients made him commit perjury, he will be the one to turn on them. I needed to steel myself. I needed to remember exactly who I was fighting. I stopped looking at legal papers and went into my personal archives. I dug through old cloud backups of my phone looking for deleted voicemails. I found one from 8 months ago. It was from a period when I had briefly blocked Blair's number. So the call had gone straight to voicemail. I had never listened to it. I put on my headphones and pressed play. Blair's voice filled my ears. She sounded drunk. It was late at night. Scarlett, pick up the phone. Mom says you're buying another building. Who do you think you are? You think you can just outgrow us. You can't keep assets from family. Scarlett, it is not natural. You are nothing without us. You are just the little helper. Remember that. I listened to it 3 times. You are just the little helper. It wasn't about the money. It was about the hierarchy. They could not stand the idea that the servant had become the master. I saved the file and named it Exhibit Z. We met one last time before the hearing to finalize the strategy. The plan Elliot drafted was a work of art. It was not a defense. It was a trap. We are going to let them open, Elliot said, pacing the room. We are going to let Elton paint you as the villain. We are going to let Blair take the stand. We are going to ask her gentle questions. Is this your signature? Did you see Scarlett sign this? Was this intended for family gatherings? He stopped and looked at me. We need them to lock themselves into the lie, he said. We need the record to show them affirming the fraud under oath. Only then When there is absolutely no wiggle room, do we introduce the LLC formation date. Only then do we introduce the conservation deed. Only then do we play the voicemail. He slammed his hand on the table. We detonate the evidence step by step. By the time we are done, the judge will not just dismiss the case. She will want to arrest them. I looked at the timeline on the wall. It was a map of their destruction. I have one condition, Elliot, I said. He looked at me. Anything. No drama, I said. My voice was calm, colder than I had ever heard it. I do not want to scream at them. I do not want to cry. I do not want a scene. I stood up and smoothed my blazer. Blair thrives on chaos. I said, she wants a soap opera. She wants me to break down so she can comfort me and take control. If I get angry, she wins. I looked Elliot in the eye. We win by precision. I said, I want to be surgical. I want to dismantle them with math and dates and paper. I want to be so quiet that they can hear the career of their attorney dying in real time. Elliot nodded slowly. Ice. He said, ice. I agreed. I went home that night and laid out my clothes for court. A dark navy suit, minimal makeup, no jewelry except a small watch. I practiced my breathing. I visualized the courtroom. I was not the victim. I was the CEO of a holding company dealing with a hostile entity. I thought about the mountain standing silent and strong in the snow, protected by the laws of nature and the laws of men. They wanted to turn it into a party venue. They wanted to fill it with noise and ego. They had no idea that the house was just bait and tomorrow the trap would snap shut. The courtroom air had grown stagnant, heavy with the weight of spoken lies. Mr. Elton, Blair's attorney, was in the middle of a performance that would have won an award on Broadway. He was pacing the length of the plaintiff's table, his voice modulating between concern and sorrow. He was building the coffin for my reputation. Plank by plank, Your Honor, Elton said, gesturing toward me with a pitying open hand. We take no pleasure in bringing this matter to a public forum. The Whittaker family has spent years privately managing MS, Diaz's volatility. But when a significant asset, a home intended for the generational enjoyment of the entire family, is held hostage by an individual who has historically demonstrated an inability to manage her own affairs, the court must intervene. I sat perfectly still. My hands were clasped on the table, my thumbs pressed together hard enough to turn the skin white. I focused on my breathing. In 2, 3, out, 2, 3. I could feel Grant's eyes on the side of my face. I did not turn to look at him, but I knew exactly what expression he was wearing. He was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, watching me with the intensity of a predator waiting for a wounded animal to stumble. He wanted me to snap. He needed me to snap. The entire case relied on the narrative that I was erratic. If I cried, if I shouted, if I rolled my eyes, I would be handing them the evidence they needed. Grant was practically willing me to lose control. He wanted the Scarlett from 10 years ago, the tired, frustrated waitress, to erupt so he could point a finger and say, see, she is unstable. But that Scarlett was gone. The woman sitting at the defense table was an operator who had negotiated with city councils and hostile contractors. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of a single tear. We are asking the court, Elton continued, to enforce the written agreement signed last year. We are asking that the ownership be corrected to reflect the true intent of the parties, a shared family trust managed by Mrs. Ale to ensure the property is not lost to foreclosure or impulsive liquidation. Judge Keene had been listening quietly, her face a mask of judicial neutrality. She was taking notes, her pen scratching rhythmically against the paper. When Elton finally paused to take a sip of water, she looked up. Mr. Elton, the judge said. Her voice was calm, but it cut through the theatrical atmosphere instantly. Yes, Your Honor, Elton replied, straightening his tie, looking confident. I would like to return to a question I asked at the beginning of this session, Judge Keene said. She flipped back a page in her notebook. You have characterized MS. Dyers as financially incompetent. You have stated that the Silver Pine Ridge property is a burden she cannot carry alone. That is correct, Your Honor. Elton said the maintenance costs alone on a luxury A-frame in that zip code are astronomical. MS. Dyer's works were worked in administrative assistance. The math simply does not add up without family support. Judge Keene nodded slowly. And yet, she said, the deed to the property is held by Dyer's Ridge Holdings, LLC. Elton waved his hand dismissively. A shell entity, Your Honor, a common tactic for people trying to hide assets or complicate liability. It does not change the fact that MS. Dyer's is the sole operator, and as we have established, she lacks the acumen to manage such a complex asset. The LLC is just a name on a piece of paper. It does not represent a real business. I saw Elliot stiffen beside me. This was the opening. Grant whispered something to Blair. Blair nodded, looking solemn and concerned. My parents, sitting in the gallery, leaned forward. My mother clutched her purse as if she were watching a tragedy unfold. They really believed it. That was the terrifying part. They had told themselves this story for so long that they believed I was a helpless child playing dress-up with a mortgage I could not afford. Judge Keene looked at me. MS. Dyer's. The judge said, is the LLC just a name on a piece of paper? I stood up. I felt the gaze of everyone in the room. The bailiff, the clerk, my family. It is a holding company. Your Honor, I said clearly. Judge Keene studied me for a long moment. She was looking for the crack. She was looking for the tremor in my voice. She did not find it. She turned back to Elton. If the court is to determine the validity of this contract, and by extension, the competency of the defendant, we need to understand the scope of what is being transferred. You claim she cannot manage the house. She cannot, Elton insisted. It is a disaster waiting to happen. Elliot stood up. His movement was smooth, practiced. He buttoned his suit jacket. Your Honor, Elliot said, his voice deep and resonant. The plaintiff has opened the door to my client's financial character. They have built their entire case on the assertion that MS. Dyer's is reckless, broke, and incapable of managing real estate. That is the foundation of our complaint. Yes, Elton agreed, looking annoyed at the interruption. Then Elliot continued, ignoring him and addressing the judge. The defense requests permission to introduce evidence regarding the actual operational history of Dyer's Ridge Holdings, LLC, if we are to evaluate whether MS. Dyer's is capable of managing this specific property. We must look at her track record. We must provide context. Elton frowned. Objection. Your Honor, he said. Relevance. We are litigating the ownership of one specific house in Silver Pine Ridge. MS. Dyer's other attempts at business are not on trial here. Judge Keene peered over her glasses. Mr. Elton, you just spent 20 minutes telling me the defendant is financially incompetent. If she has evidence to the contrary, it goes directly to the credibility of your witness and the validity of your claims for guardianship-style oversight. She turned to Elliot. The objection is overruled. You may proceed, Mr. Ace. Elliot nodded to me. I reached down and opened the heavy banker's box we had placed under the table. The sound of the cardboard scraping against the floor was the only noise in the room. I pulled out the first binder. It was 3 and thick, labeled Portfolio Overview 2024. Elliot took it and walked to the podium. He placed it down with a heavy thud. He did not open it immediately. He looked at Blair. She was frowning, her perfect eyebrows pulled together in confusion. She had never seen this binder. She thought my financial life fit in a shoebox. Your Honor, Elliot began, opening the binder. The plaintiff claims that the Silver Pine Ridge property is a luxury retreat that MS. Dyer's purchased impulsively. They claim she is drowning in debt. He pulled out a summary sheet and placed it on the overhead projector. The numbers glowed on the screen behind him, stark and white against the dark wall. The Silver Pine Ridge property, Elliot said, pointing to a line item near the bottom of the list, represents approximately 8% of the total real estate assets currently under management by Dyer's Ridge Holdings. A murmur went through the courtroom. I saw Grant's head snap up. He squinted at the screen. 8%, Judge Keene repeated. She sounded surprised. Correct, Your Honor, Elliot said. He flipped a page on the projector, the screen filled with a grid. It was my master spreadsheet. It listed addresses, purchase dates, rental yields, and occupancy rates. M. Dyer's does not own one home, Elliot said, his voice rising slightly. "She owns and operates a portfolio consisting of a multi-family duplex in the North Ward, a retail strip mall on Henderson Avenue, a mixed-use historic building on 4th Street involving 4 commercial leases and 6 residential units, and the Arts Annex Theater, which she leases to a nonprofit for $1 a year." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum. Blair's mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. She looked at the screen, reading the addresses. She knew the retail strip. She bought her dry cleaning there. She knew the 4th Street building. She and Grant had eaten at the bistro on the ground floor just last week. She looked at me. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated. It was the look of someone realizing the ground they were standing on was actually a trapdoor. Elliot continued, relentless. "This portfolio has a 0% default rate. He said every mortgage is paid within 48 hours of the due date. The operational cash flow is positive for 42 consecutive months. The reserve accounts for maintenance are funded at 150% of the industry standard." He turned to Elton, who was standing frozen at his table, a look of horror rising on his face. "Does this look like the resume of a financially reckless woman?" Elliot asked. "Or does this look like the resume of an institutional investor?" Grant was reading the numbers on the screen. I could see his lips moving. He was doing the math. He was calculating the equity. He was realizing that the little property hobby he had mocked was actually a machine worth millions of dollars. His posture, usually so arrogant and expansive, began to collapse. He shrank into his suit. He looked at his wife, and for the first time there was no solidarity in his eyes. There was blame. He looked at her as if to say, "You told me she was broke." My parents were shifting uncomfortably in the gallery. My father took off his glasses and cleaned them, a nervous tic he only displayed when he was losing an argument. My mother was whispering to him, pointing at the screen, shaking her head in denial. They could not process it. It broke their worldview. If I was successful wildly, independently successful, then their neglect was not tough love. It was just neglect. Judge Keene was leaning so far forward over the bench that she was almost standing. She was reading every line on the projection. "MS. Dyers," the judge said, addressing me directly. "You manage all of these yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." I said. I stood up again. I utilized a property management software for the rent collection, but I handled the acquisitions, the contractor negotiations, and the tax filings myself, and the renovation on the 4th Street building. The judge asked. "I know that building. It was a condemned eyesore for 10 years. I oversaw the structural rehabilitation." "Your Honor," I said, "we had to jack the foundation and replace the main load-bearing beams. I sauced the steel myself to keep the budget under $20,000. The judge looked at Blair. Blair was pale. Her carefully applied blush stood out like bruises on her cheeks. She was gripping the edge of the table. "Mrs. Hale," Judge Keene said. Her voice was deceptively soft. Blair stood up. She looked shaky. "Yes, Your Honor." "Were you aware that your sister owns a commercial real estate portfolio?" Blair stammered. We knew she had some projects, but we thought they were small. We thought she was in over her head." "You thought she was in over her head," the judge repeated. "And yet, looking at these balance sheets, she seems to be the only person in this courtroom who understands how to run a profit." Elton tried to intervene. "Your Honor, this is all very impressive, but it does not negate the contract. The fact that she has other money does not mean she did not gift this specific house to her family. In fact, it makes it more likely. If she is so wealthy, why wouldn't she share?" It was a desperate pivot, but it was all he had. Judge Keene looked at Elton. Then she looked at the stack of binders on the defense table. Then she looked at the single thin piece of paper that was the plaintiff's entire case. The atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. 5 minutes ago, I was a defendant trying to prove I wasn't crazy. Now I was a force of nature, and my family were the ones looking small, petty, and confused. "I want to see the full picture before I believe anyone's story," Judge Keene said. She pointed a finger at the binders. "Mr. Hayes, enter those into evidence, all of them. I want the court clerk to verify the dates of acquisition." She turned her gaze to Grant and Mr. Elton, she said, her voice sharpening. You might want to take a moment to consult with your clients, because if this court finds that you have misrepresented the defendant's financial status to support a claim of incompetency, we are going to have a very different conversation." Grant looked at me. The smuggness was gone. The threat was gone. In his eyes I saw the one thing I had never seen there before: respect and fear. Blair leaned over to him, whispering frantically. He pulled his arm away from her, a sharp, angry motion. The united front was cracking. I sat back down. I took a sip of water. My hand was perfectly steady. The trap was set. The bait was taken. And now the walls were closing in. "We haven't even gotten to the contract yet," Elliot whispered to me, keeping his face neutral. "I know," I replied softly. This was just the context. The kill shot was still to come. But as I looked at my parents, huddled together and looking at me like I was a stranger they had just met, I realized the hardest part was already over. They finally saw me, and they were terrified of what they saw. The silence in the courtroom was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum after all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Elliot did not let the moment settle. He treated the binder he had just opened like a hymnal, preaching the gospel of fiscal responsibility. He flipped to the section labeled Commercial Assets. "Your Honor," Elliot said, his voice projecting to the back of the room where my parents sat frozen. "To further address the plaintiff's claim that Miss Dyers requires financial oversight, let us examine the asset known as Emberlight Commons." I watched Blair's face. The name registered instantly. Emberlight Commons was a renovated warehouse district downtown, a brick-and-mortar testament to gentrification done right. It housed a high-end yoga studio, an organic bakery, a boutique wine shop, and a workspace for tech startups. It was the place to be seen on a Saturday morning. Blair loved Emberlight Commons. I knew for a fact she held her monthly book club, which was really just a gossip and wine session at the bistro on the corner unit. The plaintiff, Elliot continued, turning to look at Blair, is likely familiar with this location. "I believe the credit card statements provided in discovery show that Mrs. Hale spent over $400 at the Gilded Vine last month alone." Blair blinked. She looked at Grant, then back at Elliot. "What does that have to do with anything?" Elton snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier punch. "We are talking about my client's lifestyle, which is not on trial." "It is relevant, Your Honor," Elliot said smoothly, "because Ms. Dyers owns the building." The gasp from the gallery was audible. It came from my mother. She put a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting from the screen to me. Elliot pressed a button and the screen changed. It showed the deed for the Emberlight property held by a subsidiary LLC, which rolled up to Dyers Ridge Holdings. It showed the rent rolls. It showed the net operating income. Ms. Dyers acquired this property as a derelict industrial site 4 years ago. Elliot explained she navigated the zoning changes. She secured the historical tax credits. She interviewed and selected every commercial tenant. And every time the plaintiff purchased a bottle of wine or paid for a yoga class in that building, she was indirectly contributing to the defendant's profit margins. I allowed myself a small, tight smile. I watched the realization wash over Blair. She wasn't just realizing I was rich. She was realizing she had been a customer in my world. Every time she had walked through those doors, thinking she was the queen of the city, she had been walking on my floors. Grant was staring at the screen with a look of sick fascination. He knew the Emberlight project. He had tried to get a bid on the electrical work for it years ago and had been rejected. He had been rejected by an anonymous manager who he now realized was his sister-in-law. "But we are not done, Your Honor," Elliot said. He closed the Emberlight binder and opened a thinner black volume. "The plaintiff claims Ms. Dyers is selfish, that she hoards assets, that she has no sense of community or family legacy." He held up a photo. It was the Lyric Royale Theatre, the crown jewel of the city's arts district. It was a beautiful, ornate building from the 1920s that had been slated for demolition 2 years ago. The city had mourned its potential loss. My parents had even attended a Save the Lyric fundraiser where they donated $50 and drank free champagne. When the theater was saved at the 11th hour by a mystery donor, the paper ran a front-page story. The donor was never named. Elliot placed the document on the projector. The Lyric Real is held in a blind trust managed by Dyer's Ridge Holdings, Elliot said, Ms. Dyers purchased the note from the bank hours before foreclosure. She then executed a 99-year lease to the Arts Preservation Society for the sum of $1 per year. He paused, letting the weight of that number hang in the air. $1. She covers the insurance. She covers the exterior maintenance. She received zero profit. She did this solely to preserve a cultural landmark for this city. Judge Keene took off her glasses. She looked at the photo of the theater, then at the spreadsheet showing the $1 a year lease, and finally at me. Her expression had shifted completely. The skepticism that had been there at the start of the hearing was gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing assessment. Ms. Dyers, the judge said. Why, I stood up. I did not look at my family. I spoke only to her. Because I could, Your Honor, I said simply, and because some things are worth more than the rent you can charge for them. The judge nodded slowly. She turned to Elton, who was shuffling papers frantically, trying to find a foothold in an avalanche. Mr. Elton, Judge Keene said, her voice dried and dangerous. You opened this hearing by telling me your client needed to take control of the defendant's assets to prevent her from ruining herself. You described her as impulsive. She gestured to the screen where the Ember Light and Lyric documents were still glowing. Does this look like impulsivity to you? She asked. Or does this look like long-term planning executed with a level of sophistication that frankly exceeds that of the plaintiffs? Elton opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at Grant. Grant was not looking at him. Grant was staring at the table, his face a mask of red-hot humiliation. Blair, however, was not done. She could not accept that the narrative had flipped. She stood up, ignoring her lawyer's hand, reaching out to stop her. Tears were streaming down her face now, but they weren't the pretty cinematic tears she had started with. These were the blotchy, desperate tears of a child who had been told no for the first time. She deceived us, Blair cried out, her voice cracking. She pointed a trembling finger at me. She sat at our dinner table for years and acted poor. She let us pay for dinner. She let Mom and Dad worry about her. She hid all of this. Mrs. Hale, sit down, the judge warned. No, Blair shouted. It is not fair. She watched us struggle to maintain our lifestyle. She watched Grant stress about his development deals, and she was sitting on millions. She lied to us by omission. How can you trust a person who hides her entire life from her own mother? She turned to the gallery, appealing to our parents. Mom, tell her how much you worried. Diane Whittaker looked like she had been turned to stone. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and glassy. She wasn't seeing a daughter. She was seeing a missed opportunity. She was calculating how much of my success she could have claimed credit for if she had known. She didn't speak. She just shrank back against the bench. Blair turned back to the judge, sobbing. She tricked us into thinking she needed help. Blair wailed. That is why we did the contract. We were trying to protect her. That was the mistake. Elliot didn't even have to say it. The room felt it. Blair had just admitted that the contract was created because they thought I needed help. But the contract was dated a year ago. If they thought I needed help, then why was the lawsuit only happening now? And if they were trying to protect me, why did the contract give them ownership? Judge Keene's face hardened. She was done with the theatrics. Mrs. Hale, your emotional distress regarding your sister's privacy is noted, the judge said coldly. But in this court, we deal with facts. And the fact is, you are suing to enforce a contract based on a premise that has just been proven demonstrably false. She looked at the defense table. Mr. Hayes, the judge said, you mentioned earlier that there were irregularities regarding the document itself. Yes, Your Honor, Elliot said. We are prepared to address the instrument of the alleged fraud. Fraud, Grant hissed. He shot up from his chair. Mr. Elton grabbed Grant's arm and yanked him back down. I saw Elton whisper something sharply into Grant's ear. I could read the body language. It was the universal sign for shut up or I will walk out of here right now. Elton looked pale. He was a shark. Yes, but he was a shark who liked to swim in safe waters. He had just realized he was swimming in a pool full of chum, and his clients were the ones bleeding. He looked at the binder Elliot had just closed, the one proving I was a meticulous, high-level operator. Then he looked at the contract his clients had given him, a flimsy piece of paper supposedly signed by a reckless woman. The math didn't work for him anymore, either. Judge Keene leaned over the bench. She extended her hand. "I want to see the original contract," she said. "Not the copy. The original with the wet signature." There was a hesitation at the plaintiff's table that lasted 5 seconds, but felt like 5 hours. Elton looked at Grant. Grant looked at his briefcase. He didn't move. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards, "produce the document." Grant's hands were shaking as he reached into his leather bag. He pulled out a clear plastic sleeve. Inside was the paper they had printed on a laser printer in Grant's office, the paper they had signed with a pen they bought at a drugstore, the paper they had backdated to steal my house. He handed it to Elton. Elton walked it up to the bench like he was carrying a live grenade. Judge Keene took the plastic sleeve. She did not look at the text. She looked at the signature. She held it up to the light. She looked at me. "M.S. Dyers." The judge said, "Is this your signature?" I stood up. "It looks like my name, Your Honor," I said clearly, "but I did not sign it." The judge looked at Blair. "Mrs. Hale, did you witness your sister sign this?" Blair wiped her face. She looked at Grant. Grant was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle was jumping in his cheek. He couldn't help her. She was on the cliff edge alone. "Yes," Blair whispered. "She signed it at the kitchen table last July." "And you, Mr. Hale?" the judge asked. "You are listed as the witness." Grant cleared his throat. It sounded like grinding gears. "Yes, Your Honor. I witnessed it." The trap snapped shut. Judge Keene placed the document down on her bench. She placed her hand over it flat and heavy. "Very well," she said. "The plaintiffs have attested under oath to the authenticity of this document." She looked at Elliot. "Call your next witness, Mr. Ace." Elliot smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "The defense calls Dr. Aries Thorne, forensic document examiner," he said. As Dr. Thorne stood up from the back of the room, clutching his heavy black case, I looked at Grant. He had stopped breathing. He realized too late that the portfolio reveal was just the opening act. We had stripped them of their moral high ground. Now we were about to strip them of their freedom. The murmurs in the gallery had turned into a buzz of anticipation. My parents looked like they wanted to vanish. They realized they were not watching a ceremony of restitution. They were watching an autopsy of their own family. And I was the one holding the scalpel. Dr. Aries Thorne took the stand with the clinical detachment of a man who spent more time with microscopes than human beings. He was a small man wearing a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of chemicals, and he carried his findings in a binder that was thick enough to be a weapon. He did not look at me. He did not look at Blair. He looked only at the judge, ready to present the autopsy of a lie. Elliot stood at the podium, his posture relaxed. He knew exactly what was coming. "Dr. Thorne," Elliot began, "please state your occupation for the court." "I am a forensic document examiner," Dr. Thorne said. His voice was dry and precise, like snapping twigs. "I specialize in the analysis of handwriting, ink composition, and paper origin." Elliot nodded. He gestured to the plastic sleeve sitting on the judge's bench, the one containing the so-called original contract. "You have examined this document?" Elliot asked. "I have," Thorne replied. "I subjected it to distinct spectral analysis and electrostatic detection." "And what did you find regarding the ink used for the signatures?" Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses. He opened his binder to page 5. The document is dated July 14th, 2023. He read, "The signatures were executed using a black gel-based ink, specifically a Pilot G2 limited edition formula. Is that significant?" Elliot asked. "It is, Dr. Thorne said." He looked up, his eyes magnifying behind his lenses. "The chemical composition of this specific ink batch contains a unique polymer stabilizer that the manufacturer introduced to the market in November of 2023. The room went quiet. I watched the judge's head snap up. November. Judge Keene asked. Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Thorne said, it is chemically impossible for this ink to have been placed on paper in July. The ink did not exist until 4 months after the alleged date of signing. I looked at Grant. He was staring at the table, a vein throbbing in his temple. He had signed the forgery with a pen from his desk, never thinking that the chemical history of a $2 office supply would be his undoing. Science does not care about narratives, Dr. Thorne added, almost bored. It only cares about timelines, and this timeline is a fabrication. Mr. Elton, Blair's attorney, was staring at the document examiner with a look of dawning horror. He turned to Grant, whispering urgently. Grant shook his head, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He was trying to whisper back, likely lying to his lawyer even now. But the damage was done. Elliot was not finished. Dr. Thorne, Elliot continued, let us discuss the paper itself. Were you able to identify the source? Yes. Dr. Thorne said, every laser printer leaves a microscopic coat of yellow dots on the page. It is a tracking measure used to prevent counterfeiting. It identifies the make, model, and serial number of the machine. And did you trace the serial number found on this contract? Dr. Thorne nodded. He projected a magnified image onto the screen. It looked like a constellation of tiny, faint stars. This document was printed on a Xerox Altinct 8100, serial number X4592, he said. And who is the registered owner of that machine? Elliot asked. Dr. Thorne turned the page. The device is registered to the Hale Development Group located at 400 Executive Park Drive. I watched the air leave Grant's body. He slumped in his chair. The kitchen table story. The lie that we had all sat around casually at my apartment signing papers was dead. They had printed the contract in Grant's office, likely late at night, thinking they were being clever. They had created the evidence of their own crime on a machine that was practically shouting their name. Mr. Elton stood up. He looked unsteady. Your Honor, he said, his voice trembling. I need a moment to confer with my clients. I was not made aware of these discrepancies. Sit down, Mr. Elton. Judge Keene said. Her voice was no longer neutral. It was ice cold. You will have time to confer when I am finished hearing the extent of this dissection. She looked at Elliot. Continue. Mr. Ace. Elliot turned away from the forensic expert. He walked toward the jury box. Even though there was no jury, he was playing to the room. We have established that the document is a forgery, Elliot said. We have established that the ink is from the future and the paper is from the plaintiff's office. But the question remains why? Why now? Why did a family that ignored MS, diarist for years, suddenly decide they needed to own her home? He walked back to the defense table and picked up a single piece of paper. Exhibit G. Elliot announced. The screen changed. It displayed a timeline. On January 12th at 8 in the morning, the website The Gilded Weekend published an article featuring the Silver Pine Ridge property, Elliot said. He pointed to the next hash mark on the timeline. On January 13th at 9 in the morning, exactly 25 hours later, Blair Whittaker made her first phone call to MS. Dyers in 6 months. He looked at Blair. She was crying again, but this time nobody was offering her a tissue. She looked small, huddled in her designer cardigan. The motive is not protection, Elliot said. The motive is not family legacy. The motive is greed, triggered by a magazine article. They saw something beautiful. They realized they did not own it, and they decided to take it. Blair's head snapped up. That is not true, she shouted, her voice shrill and breaking. I just wanted us to be together. I wanted the family to have a place. Elliot turned to her. Is that so? He asked. He nodded to the court clerk. Play the audio file, please. Exhibit said. The sound of static filled the room, followed by Blair's voice. It was the voicemail I had found. The one she left when she was drunk and angry. The one she thought I had deleted. Scarlett, pick up the phone. Mom says you are buying another building. Who do you think you are? You think you can just outgrow us. You cannot keep assets from family. Scarlett, it is not natural. You are nothing without us. You are just the little helper. Remember that. The voice in the recording was venomous. It dripped with entitlement and cruelty. It was not the voice of a concerned sister. It was the voice of a bully who was losing control of her victim. The courtroom was dead silent. I saw the court reporter cease. "You are just the little helper." The words hung in the air like smoke. Blair covered her face with her hands. Elliot let the silence stretch for 10 seconds. Then he turned his attention to the gallery. But Blair did not act alone. Elliot said this was a coordinated effort, a family affair. He picked up a stack of printouts. "We subpoenaed the text message history between Blair Whittaker and her parents, Diane and Warren Whittaker. For the weeks leading up to this lawsuit, my parents froze. My father's face went gray. My mother gripped his arm so hard her knuckles were white." Elliot began to read. January 20th. From Diane Whittaker to Blair. "Make sure you tell the lawyer that Scarlett looks tired. We need to emphasize the mental health angle. If we say she is unstable, the judge will have to give us oversight." He picked up another sheet. January 22nd. From Warren Whittaker to Blair. "Do not mention the rental income. If the judge knows the house makes money, she won't believe it is a burden. Stick to the script. We are doing this to save her. Stick to the script." I turned in my chair and looked at my parents. I looked them dead in the eye. For years I had thought they were just passive, that they just loved Blair more. But this was active malice. They had coached her. They had helped script the destruction of my reputation because they couldn't stand the idea that I didn't need them. Diane Whittaker looked away. She couldn't meet my gaze. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, refusing to acknowledge the shame that was radiating off him in waves. Mr. Elton looked like he was going to be sick. He had been arguing the case based on lies fed to him by a committee of conspirators. He realized now that he was not just losing. He was standing in the blast radius of a felony fraud charge. Brandt finally cracked. The pressure in the room was too much. The forensic evidence, the timeline, the voicemail, the texts, it was an avalanche. "It was not my idea," Grant blurted out. He stood up, knocking his chair back. It clattered loudly against the floor. "Grant!" Blair shrieked, grabbing his sleeve. "Shut up!" "No!" Grant shouted, pulling away from her. He looked at the judge, desperate, sweating. "Your Honor, I didn't want to file this. Blair told me we had rights. She told me her parents said it was okay, you coward." Blair screamed, jumping to her feet. "You printed it. You are the one who found the template online. You said we could backdate it. I did what you told me to do." Grant yelled back, his voice cracking. "You said Scarlett would fold. You said she was weak." The facade didn't just crack, it exploded. They were turning on each other in real time, tearing each other apart to save their own skins. It was ugly, visceral, and pathetic. "Order!" Judge Keene shouted. She slammed her gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot. "Order in this court." Grant and Blair froze, breathing heavily, staring at each other with pure hatred. Judge Keene stood up. She was trembling with suppressed rage. I had never seen a judge look so angry. "Sit down, both of you," she commanded. Now they collapsed into their chairs. Grant put his head in his hands. Blair was sobbing. A roar, ugly sound. Judge Keene leaned over the bench. Her eyes were hard as flint. "I have sat on this bench for 15 years," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I have seen bad contracts. I have seen bitter divorces, but I have rarely seen a conspiracy this transparent, this malicious, and this clumsy, attempting to use my courtroom as a weapon." She looked at Grant. "Mr. Hale, you just admitted on the record to manufacturing evidence. You admitted to backdating a legal instrument." She looked at Blair. "Mrs. Hale, you just admitted to conspiring to defraud your sister in this court." She looked at Elton counsel. She said, "I am assuming for the sake of your license that you were unaware of the origin of these documents." I was completely unaware." "Your Honor," Elton stammered, I am mortified. I move to withdraw as counsel immediately." "Granted," the judge snapped. She turned her gaze back to the defendants. "Let me be very clear," she said. "This civil trial is effectively over, but your problems are just beginning. I am referring this entire record, the forged contract, the false testimony, the text messages to the district attorney's office for review." A gasp went through the room. "Perjury is a felony," Judge Keene said. "Forgery is a felony." Attempted grand larceny is a felony." She looked at my parents in the gallery. "And do not think you are immune," she added. "The text messages indicate conspiracy to commit fraud. If the district attorney decides to cast a wide net, you will all be caught in it." My mother let out a small strangled cry. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The judge looked at me, her expression softened just a fraction. "Ms. Dyers," she said, "you have endured a character assassination that no one should have to bear." I nodded, unable to speak. I felt a profound sense of exhaustion washing over me, but it was a clean exhaustion. The weight was gone. The secret was out. The judge turned back to the court clerk. "We are done here," she said. "Valet, secure the exits. No one leaves until the sheriff's deputies arrive to take statements." She slammed the gavel one last time. Silence fell over the room like a hammer. It was absolute. Blair was staring at the table, her face a mask of shock. Grant was weeping silently. My parents were paralyzed. And I sat there surrounded by my binders, by the proof of my life's work, and watched the people who had tried to steal it realize that they had lost everything. They had come for a house and they had lost their freedom. I looked at Elliot. He closed his folder. "That," he whispered, "is how you clear the board." I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just watched. This was the justice I had promised myself in the dark nights of my past. It was cold, it was mathematical, and it was complete. The silence that followed the judge's order to secure the doors was not the quiet of a library. It was the suffocating silence of a crypt. The air in the courtroom felt thin, as if the collective shock of the last 10 minutes had consumed all the oxygen. Judge Keene did not look at her notes. She did not look at the clock. She folded her hands on the bench, interlacing her fingers, and looked down at the defendants with a gaze that stripped them of their last remaining shreds of dignity. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that pressed us all into our seats. "In my 15 years on this bench," Judge Keene began, "I have presided over thousands of disputes. I have seen siblings fight over inheritances. I have seen business partners betray one another for profit, but I have rarely seen a plaintiff come into my court with unclean hands so filthy they leave a stain on the judicial process itself." She picked up the file containing the forged contract and dropped it. It hit the wood with a flat final slap. "The petition brought by Blair Whittaker and Grant Hale is hereby dismissed with prejudice," the judge declared. "That means you cannot refile. You cannot amend. This claim is dead, and it is buried." Blair let out a small strangled sound like a whimper. She was staring at the judge, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks, ruining the perfect polished image she had spent a lifetime curating. Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice hardening into steel, "This court makes a specific finding of credibility against the plaintiffs based on the forensic evidence presented by the defense, evidence which stands unrefuted. I find that the document submitted as exhibit is a fraudulent instrument. I find that the testimony given by Mrs. Hale and Mr. Hale regarding the signing of this document was a deliberate falsehood delivered under oath." She turned her eyes to Grant. He was trembling his expensive suit. Once his armor now looked like a costume he was too small to wear. "Mr. Hale, you attempted to leave this courtroom a moment ago." The judge noted, "I would advise you to remain seated. The bailiff is currently blocking the door for a reason." Grant swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at the heavy wooden doors, then back at the judge, his eyes wide with the realization that his status, his connections, and his arrogance could not unlock them. "I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office immediately," Judge Keene announced. "I am recommending a full criminal investigation into charges of forgery, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence is overwhelming, and I will personally ensure that the prosecutor receives the transcripts of your confessions today." Blair gasped, clutching her chest. "Criminal," she whispered. The word sounded foreign in her mouth. She was a Whittaker. She was a Hale. Criminals were people on the news. People who lived in bad neighborhoods, not people who hosted garden parties. The realization hit her like a physical blow. I could see it in her eyes. She was replaying the moment she stood up at the start of this trial. She was hearing her own voice, smug and triumphant, saying, "Finally, your house is mine." That sentence was no longer a victory cry. It was the epitaph of her social life. It was the sentence that had led her directly into a trap of her own making. Judge Keene was not finished. She shifted her gaze to the gallery, focusing like a laser on the first row. "Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker, stand up," she commanded. My parents looked at each other in panic. My father tried to muster some of his old authority, adjusting his jacket as he stood, but his hands were shaking. My mother stood slowly, clutching her purse to her stomach as if it could protect her from the judge's wrath. "You are not named parties in this lawsuit," Judge Keene said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But the evidence presented, specifically the text messages coaching your daughter on how to manipulate this court, implicates you as active participants in this scheme." My father opened his mouth to speak. "Your Honor, we were just quiet." The judge snapped. "You were not just anything," she said. "You were the architects. You encouraged your daughter to perjure herself. You advised her to feign concern for a sister you clearly know nothing about. You sat in my courtroom and nodded along while your attorney assassinated your youngest daughter's character." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "If the district attorney decides to view this as a conspiracy, do not be surprised if you find yourselves named as co-defendants in the criminal proceedings. You should call your own lawyers immediately." My mother collapsed back onto the bench, burying her face in her hands. My father stood there, grave-faced and hollow, staring at a spot on the wall, unable to look at me. Then Mr. Elton, the attorney who had started the day so confidently, stood up. He looked 10 years older than he had an hour ago. "Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy, "I formally request permission to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs. Effective immediately. My continued representation would constitute an ethical violation given the revelations of client dissection." "Granted," the judge said coldly. "You are excused. Mr. Elton, I suggest you cooperate fully with the authorities." Elton did not look at Blair or Grant. He packed his briefcase with frantic speed, snapped it shut, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. He left them there alone at the table, exposed and defenseless. The silence returned. It was just us now, the judge, the baifs, the shattered remains of my family, and me. Judge Keene turned to me. Her expression softened. It wasn't pity I saw in her eyes. It was respect. "Ms. Dyers," she said, "you have sat quietly while your family tried to dismantle your life. You have let the evidence speak for you. But before I close this record, I am giving you the opportunity to speak. Is there anything you wish to say?" I stood up. My legs felt strong. My hands resting on the table were steady. I looked at Blair. She was slumped in her chair, a ruin of a woman. I looked at Grant, who was staring at his hands. I looked at my parents, who were huddled together like frightened children. I did not feel happy. I did not feel a rush of joy. I felt a deep, profound sense of closure. It was the feeling of closing a book that you never wanted to read in the first place. I walked out from behind the defense table. I stood in the center of the aisle, halfway between the judge and my family. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and controlled. "For years my family told a story about me. They told themselves I was weak. They told themselves I was a failure who needed their charity. They told themselves that my silence was incompetence." I turned to look directly at Blair. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. They built their entire self-worth on the idea that they were better than me. I continued. "Blair needed me to be the renter so she could be the owner. Grant needed me to be the failure so he could feel like a success. My parents needed me to be the dependent child so they could feel like benevolent saviors." I took a breath. They asked why I hid my success. I said they asked why I did not tell them about the buildings, the investments, the life I built. I looked at my mother. She peeked through her fingers, tears streaming down her wrists. I did not hide my success out of spite. I said, my voice dropping to a register that carried the weight of 1,000 lonely dinners. "I hid it because I realized a long time ago that you only loved me when I was small." The sob that escaped my mother's throat was loud and jagged. "You only loved me when I was struggling." I said, "When I was on my knees, you were there to pat my head and tell me it would be okay. But the moment I stood up, the moment I started to climb, you did not cheer for me. You tried to pull me back down." You did not want a sister. You wanted a subordinate. I turned back to the judge. I am not unstable. Your Honor, I am not reckless, and I am certainly not a victim. I am the CEO of Dyer's Ridge Holdings. I am a builder, and today I am done being their daughter. I walked back to my table. One last thing, Your Honor, Elliot said, standing up. We have prepared a motion for permanent restraining orders against all 4 individuals present. We are also petitioning for a formal order barring them from coming within 500 ft of any property owned or managed by MS. Dyers or her associated entities. Brandt looked up, panic flaring in his eyes again. Any property, he choked out. But she owns half the downtown district. I have meetings there. I have. That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Hill. Judge Keene cut in. She looked at the motion Elliot had handed the clerk. Given the harassment, the attempted fraud, and the emotional abuse demonstrated here, the protective orders are granted effective immediately. The judge ruled, if you step foot on her land, you will be arrested for trespassing. If you call her, you will be arrested. If you text her, you will be arrested. Do I make myself clear, Crystal? Brandt whispered. Defeated. Judge Keene banged the gavel. This court is adjourned. Sheriff, take the defendants into custody for processing. The sound of the deputies moving forward was the only thing I heard. I saw the silver handcuffs gleam under the fluorescent lights. I saw Blair recoil as a deputy asked her to place her hands behind her back. I cannot go to jail, she wailed. I have a garler next week. I did not watch. I turned my back on them. I gathered my binders. I stacked them neatly into the box. I nodded to Elliot. Ready? He asked. Ready, I said. We walked down the center aisle. I could hear the scuffle behind me, the sound of Grant pleading with the officers, the sound of my mother crying my name. Scarlett, please. We are family. I did not break stride. I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the hallway. The air out there was different. It smelled of floor wax and freedom. Sunlight was streaming through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I walked out of the courthouse and onto the wide stone steps. The city was spread out before me. I could see the skyline. I could see the brick facade of Imberlite Commons in the distance. I could see the roof of the Lyric Royale Theatre. They were mine, not because I had been given them, but because I had built them. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from my property management app. Rent deposit cleared. $10,400. I smiled. Blair had wanted the house. Grant had wanted the asset. My parents had wanted the control. But as I walked down the steps toward my car, leaving the sirens and the scandal behind me, I realized they had all missed the point. The house was never the prize. The prize was the ability to walk away. And as I turned the key in the ignition and drove toward the mountains, toward the silence and the snow, I knew I had won the only thing that mattered. I was finally completely invisible to them. And it was beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below and let's share our thoughts on Scarlett's journey. If you enjoyed this revenge drama, please subscribe to the channel Azad Revenge Stories, like the video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners. Thanks to everyone.